안내 말씀드립니다. 잠시 후
We're going to begin the seminar in a few minutes, so please take a seat.
예.
Good morning. Thank you very much for attending this seminar despite the COVID-19. And thank you for coming to our seminar, which is co-hosted by National Assembly member Lee Yong-sun and the South North Korea Exchange and Cooperation Support Association. I am Chairman Kang Young-sik of the association. As was announced, we will have a hybrid seminar today, and the panels from abroad can join virtually, and also we have panels here on site. First of all, I'd like to invite National Assembly member Lee Yong-sun, the co-host, for the welcoming remarks. He is now a member of the Foreign Affairs and Unification Committee, and he's also founded the foundation to help the inter-Korean relations. Please welcome him with a big round of applause.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lee Yong-sun, as introduced. I'm National Assembly member of ROK. First of all, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Chairperson Kang Young-sik of the South North Korea Exchange and Cooperation Support Association and relevant officials for organizing this international event. From far away, the overseas speakers, the Professor Kevin Gray and Professor Park Yi, and the lawyer David Wolf and Dr. Chung Dae-jin, and Professor Kim Yoo-jin, and lawyer Kan Soon-yeop and lawyer Kim Se-jin, Secretary General Lee Joo-sung of the Korea NGOs Council for Cooperation with North Korea, are with us today. So I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude. So now we have the grave sanctions against North Korea that initiated in the 2017. That was the international negotiation in order to deter the nuclear, the weapons, and also the other weapons of the mass destructions. And there has been the Singapore declarations and also the Korean disarmies in order to resolve these issues. But still we have the grave, sanctions against North Korea. We failed to reach the negotiations to resolve the dire situations. And actually, we are in the stumbling blocks, and for the last 3 years, this negotiation has been in that rocked situations. So amid this situation, and North Korea closed its border due to the COVID-19 pandemic, and on the top of that, natural disasters give great havoc on North Korean economy. That's why North Korea has the malfunction of its economies. And also regarding humanitarian situations, we have the worries about North Korean situations. The sanctions against North Korea that has been arranged in order to resolve the nuclear issues, but we need to shift our directions in order to find the viable options. So the food aid and the vaccine aid, and those are not the key, negotiation items from the perspective of North Korea. But actually, regarding the end of war on the Korean Peninsula and the declaration about that, North Korea showed some level of interest. So we need to find new approaches and directions in order to resolve these the sanction issues. So we need to have a clear definitions and clear understanding about the effectiveness of these North Korean sanctions and the measures to resolve this issue should be introduced. Based on that, we can invite North Korea to the negotiation table. I sincerely hope that today's international seminar will provide a great venue to look into the North Korean sanction issues and its effectiveness, and also we can introduce this effectiveness to other international society members. We are nearly the end of year. I hope you have a great end year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, National Assembly Member Lee Young-sun. And today's theme is the evaluation of sanctions against North Korea by the international community, focusing on the impact on the North Korean economy and denuclearization. And we have 3 sessions under the theme. And as you may know, and as was mentioned by Mr. Lee, the sanctions against North Korea of the international community have been lasting for a long time, and there are different perspectives on the effectiveness. However, what's clear is that since the enhancement of the sanctions of the international community, the economic and humanitarian conditions in North Korea have been worsening. Looking back on the past year, there were some interesting facts that we need to take note of. The U.S. government's Treasury Department's OFAC. Since December last year, they has not designated any sanctions against North Korea so far. And if this continues by the end of this year, it will be the first year in 9 years that we didn't see any new North Korean sanctions added. And also the exemptions for 71 humanitarian aid programs for North Korea from UN sanctions from these international NGOs and the local or the municipal government have been approved so far. So in this regard, the seminar will be a great opportunity to seek and discuss the effectiveness of these North Korean sanctions with the panels and the experts from home and abroad. I hope you will also actively participate in this whole seminar. And we have 3 presentations from different sectors, and we have 6 panelists for the discussion. So I will skip the introductions I will introduce each of them in each session.
So I believe we already have the keynote speakers on the online platform. 20 minutes will be allocated for presentations, and 10 minutes will be allocated to each panelist. Then we are going to have our shorter Q&A sessions. And if time allows, we are going to invite questions from YouTube channel. So like this, each session will have about 45-minute discussions. Then we can have good time management. But time is limited, so I'd like to ask you understanding regarding this. And we have a hybrid event, online and offline. Those who are joining this seminar on the online platform, please do use the Q&A functions on the YouTube channel. If time allowed, we are going to address your questions. If not, I'd like to ask you understanding. So now we are going to start the first session. For the first presentation, we are going to invite Professor Kevin Gray. The topic of our first session is the evaluation of the effectiveness and the limitation on sanctions. So let's invite Kevin Gray. Please keep time limit, 20 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. So the topic of my talk, as you can see, the title is the evaluation of the effects and limitations of sanctions against North Korea. But I also want to distinguish between effects and efficacy, which are slightly different things. So usually when we talk about the effects, we discuss the kind of empirical impact of the sanctions on, first off, the North Korean economy. But if we talk about the efficacy, then we're thinking about whether those empirical effects translate into the policy outcomes that the sanctions seek to achieve. And I think it's important to make that distinction. Now, in terms of efficacy, then we need to think about what are the goals of sanctions against North Korea. But this is not clear, partly because there's a whole range of different sanctions, as I'm sure everybody is aware. There's a whole range of sanctions that are applied against the country. So if we look at UN multilateral sanctions, then we see that there's a quite clear statement that the objective of the sanctions is to induce North Korea to abandon its nuclear weapons programs, its weapons of mass destruction. And in the sanctions resolution documents, it says in a complete, verifiable and irreversible manner. But then if we look at unilateral sanctions, well, we have the United States sanctions, which are a whole range of different sanctions. Some of them have been in place for decades, many, many years before the nuclear program. Some of the sanctions, which date back to the early days of the Cold War, are the same kind of sanctions that were applied to other state socialist economies, suggesting that it's the problem that the United States has with North Korea is its political system as a state socialist society. But then there are all other kinds of sanctions that have been applied since then. And then, of course, I could go on, but you have the South Korean sanctions that were imposed after the sinking of the Cheonan ship back in 2010. So all kinds of different objectives, which make it difficult then to really nail down exactly what we mean when we discuss efficacy, because they're aiming to achieve different things. And then also goals can be explicit goals, but there can also be kind of unstated goals as well. Often, I've talked about primary goals, but often as the sanctions literature suggests, you also have secondary goals where these sanctions are aimed at achieving certain kind of interests, such as satisfying domestic audiences within the countries that are sending those sanctions. So the government, in the face of a challenge or a provocation, doesn't just do nothing, but it shows that it's taking action. And internationally, this can also be the case. And also, tertiary goals, it can be about ensuring certain patterns of behavior in an international affair. So deterring other states from doing what North Korea is doing, right? Establishing certain kinds of norms in international behavior. So when I talk about efficacy, of course, this is with this kind of a disclaimer that perhaps we could argue that the sanctions have been successful on these other goals, but I'm going to limit my discussion for the rest of my talk on the primary goals of sanctions against North Korea. And I think I'm not alone in thinking or arguing that sanctions against North Korea have clearly failed, in the sense that they have failed to induce a change in the behavior of the North Korean state. But then that leads us to the questions of why exactly they failed. And again, I think it's useful here to look at the broader literature on sanctions, because this has been analyzed not just in relation to North Korea, and since going back to the 1960s. I mean, Johan Galtung wrote about sanctions that had been imposed on Rhodesia, for example, where the reasons why those sanctions failed to have an economic impact was that there were evasive strategies such as smuggling. In certain cases, this involves criminal networks, which we saw in Yugoslavia. So these kind of informal networks emerge, and states, but also individual actors, traders, they adopt a kind of evasive strategies. You also have what's known as black nights, which are countries which don't follow the sanctions regime and enable targeted states to evade sanctions. And there may be a whole other range of sort of evasive and coping mechanisms. So states can restructure their economies so they're less vulnerable to sanctions, and you can also see a form of economic informalization as well, which can lessen the impact of sanctions. And all these we can really see in the case of of North Korea. Now, of course, sanctions have not been uniform; they've changed over time. Until 2016, 2017, the impact of sanctions on the North Korean economy was fairly sort of limited or blunted by the fact that you did have these coping mechanisms, and you had the role of China as a kind of black knight that did not enforce sanctions strictly. And if you look at the panel of expert reports, I mean, it's full of examples of how this actually happened. And as I said, smuggling networks emerge, and informalization in the sense of a shift away from using formal financial mechanisms of trade settlement, but towards a kind of cash-based economy. But then we see after 2017, of course, the strengthening of sanctions, particularly in terms of the content of the UN resolutions, but also China's sort of apparent increased role in enforcing those sanctions, which it, of course, as a permanent member of the Security Council, it has a role in drawing up anyway. And there we start to see a much more marked economic and indeed humanitarian impact. I mean, I won't explain this in detail. I'm sure you're all aware of this, but you start to see a very sharp decline, especially in exports, but obviously also in imports from 2017. And this has sectoral impacts as well. Particularly, I draw your attention to minerals, which in the mid-2010s had been North Korea's largest exported item to China. But also, if you look particularly at textiles, for North Korea. So what I'd like to focus on and then is, first of all, to look at what the impacts of these sanctions are. But I want to draw attention particularly to the area of humanitarian impacts. And there's two parts to this. One is focusing on the impact on humanitarian assistance. Again, I won't say too much because time is short, and also I believe that the next speaker, Dr. Kee Park, may talk about this as well. But I think, again, this is fairly well known. The sanctions have sort of disrupted the banking channels which are used by humanitarian organizations and by United Nations bodies which operate in North Korea. So particularly with the kind of the blacklisting of the Foreign Trade Bank, it's made it almost impossible for humanitarian organizations to transfer funds into the country. It's also led to a kind of breakdown in humanitarian goods supply chains, partly because of the reluctance of particular suppliers and transporters to expose themselves to the risks of dealing with North Korea under the international sanctions regime. And then these difficulties, of course, have a knock-on effect with the increasing reluctance of donors to donate resources and money to humanitarian aid in North Korea. And of course, these sanctions restrict international cooperation to straightforward humanitarian aid, and so that puts an end to particular forms of developmental assistance which may have a longer term impact, for example, in education. And so most humanitarian organizations have reported increasing difficulties in terms of importing medicines and supplies and equipment. And these, there are kind of exemptions processes, of course, but again, as I'm sure you're aware, one of the complaints made by humanitarian organizations is that the sanctions have over time progressively increased the costs of operating because they need to employ specialists, they need to employ lawyers, and this makes the operations more difficult. But what I also want to draw attention to is something that's not discussed to a great extent sometimes in terms of the humanitarian impact, and that is the impact that the sanctions have on economic development in general in North Korea, because this is important because it has an impact on overall livelihood and the kind of the capacity of economic development to improve living standards within the country. And we can discuss these kind of sectorally. Of course, there are statistics, the Bank of Korea, for example, it has sectoral statistics which kind of attempt to quantify this impact. What we don't have a great deal of is good empirical detail of exactly what the impacts then are on North Korean society. I mean, we do have some anecdotal evidence which is collected, particularly these media organizations like Daily NK, which have connections within the country. And they do report, again, anecdotally, for example, that the ban on mineral exports has had a negative impact on mining regions within the country. It affects not just miners themselves, but of course communities and more broadly in that sense. Textile manufacturing, again, it stands to reason that with the ban on textile exports, then this will affect the increasing numbers of North Korean workers, particularly women, that we saw who are being employed in that sector up until about 2017. It's actually, with this issue, anecdotal evidence is somewhat lacking. It's a bit difficult to really work out what's happened to those workers. An interesting thing about North Korean trade data is that even though it shows textile exports have declined drastically, there still seems to be quite strong imports, or at least until the border closure last year, of the kind of components and materials that are used in the textile industry. So that's a bit of an anomaly, and it's kind of difficult to explain that. It seems to some extent the textile industry is still kind of operating. It may have been again, up until the border closure, that textiles were still making their way abroad to China, but it was just not being reported in the export statistics. Dispatch labor, again, of course, the ban on North Korea's sending of workers overseas. As we know, I mean, it's many workers have sort of remained in China and abroad, but nonetheless, the sanctions do problematize the sending abroad of new workers. And then this, of course, there's been many reports about dispatch labor as being a form of forced labor, which I think is strictly speaking true, because workers kind of have restrictions on their movement when they're abroad and have their passports confiscated, so technically forced labor, but it's also within North Korea, it's a form of upward mobility for those workers. I mean, workers pay money, they pay bribes in order to be sent overseas, and then they use that money to return and typically entrepreneurial activities when they return to the country. So these forms of livelihood are being closed off by the sanctions. Perhaps more widely reported, particularly by UN organizations, the World Food Programme, is the impact of the sanctions on the agricultural sector, particularly because it problematizes the import into North Korea of goods and materials that are essential for agricultural production, fertilizers, machinery, spare parts for equipment, but particularly fuel, oil. So North Korea has a highly industrialized agricultural sector, very energy dependent. And in fact, many ways, the agricultural sector's problems are energy. So with the kind of sanctions on energy exports to North Korea, that does sort of quite seriously problematize agricultural production. And then in general, marketization. I mean, we know marketization is a key source of livelihood. The markets are a key source of livelihood for many North Koreans. And the sanctions from 2017 have sort of depressed market activity, and the range of goods that are available for sale in the market has reduced and become more concentrated around quite simple products, food and beverages and these kind of things. And this is problematic because these are all precisely the sectors that have kind of driven the recovery of the North Korean economy since the crisis of the 1990s. And so there are many gaps in the knowledge, but I think we can sort of summarize that these sanctions are having the humanitarian impact. Now that leads us to a question. We have this economic impact, but then why haven't the sanctions worked then in terms of persuading the North Korean government to change its kind of nuclear policy? I mean, some people argue that it has. If you see the turn to diplomacy in 2019, there have been analyses that suggest that that was a result of sanctions working. But I'm somewhat skeptical about that view, because it's still the case that the process of dialogue between US and North Korea has become bogged down in quite sort of long-standing issues about in what order certain kinds of concessions are actually given. So there doesn't seem to have been a great deal of change in this kind of negotiating positions and the red lines of either party to those negotiations. But again, to understand why sanctions, why economic stress has not translated into policy change, it's worth just again going back to the sanctions literature, because this is not just a North Korean issue. So if you're familiar with the sanctions literature, then there's a very famous study done by Hufbauer and his co-authors. It's often regarded as the most optimistic of the analysis of sanctions, but they still argue that only 34% of cases of sanctions internationally have been at least partially successful. So it's a study of about 115 cases, and 34% of those were at least partially successful. And from their study, they conclude that sanctions are particularly unsuccessful if they try to bring about very major changes in the targeted states policy rather than sort of minor changes. They're also unsuccessful if they're imposed on enemy states rather than what would otherwise be friendly states. And also if they're imposed incrementally over a long period of time, again, they're not likely to be successful. And the larger the number of countries that are required to enforce the sanctions, the less likely, again, they are to be successful. So to conclude from their argument, it would seem that North Korea is actually one of the least likely cases in which we could expect success in terms of sanctions. And you know, sanctions often work by exploiting divisions between particular groupings in targeted regimes. But if we look at the North Korean case, I mean, it's very difficult to really envisage what those divisions are. It's a highly unitary, monolithic state, and I don't think anybody's really identified debates or disputes over nuclear policy, at least, and there may be in terms of other areas, but also not beyond simply not working. Sanctions can also actually be counterproductive. They can reinforce a narrative of a hostile external environment and what's known as a rally around the flag effect, where the regime is able to point to sanctions as the cause of economic hardship. And that, again, very much ties in with sort of the North Korean case. Okay, so just to summarize, I'm not saying, I don't believe that necessarily that sanctions are always wrong and should never be applied. That's not exactly what I want to argue, but what I do want to argue is that the likelihood of success needs to be weighed up against what the humanitarian impacts of those. And I think what should be avoided is a situation where there's little prospect for the successful efficacy of sanctions, but nonetheless they remain in place with all the negative humanitarian impacts that I've mentioned. And I'll finish there because I've gone over 20 minutes. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for your insightful presentation, and you also had a great time management. So regarding the presentation by the Professor Kevin Gray, and we are going to invite the two panelists, and we have the Mr. Choi Jang-ho and the Professor Kim Jong-yeon. First, I'm going to invite Mr. Choi Jang-ho. 10 minutes is allocated for your discussion. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Choi Jang-ho. I'm from the KIEP. First of all, I'd like to send my sincere gratitude for inviting me in these meaningful discussions. So actually, I'm going to make a discussions about the evaluation of the effects and limitation of the sanctions against North Korea. The Professor Kevin Gray mentioned in his presentation that regarding the primary targets, and actually this sanction against North Korea is a failure. But when I see the effectiveness of the sanctions against North Korea, I believe we are in the premature stage. So it is too early to make evaluations. And actually, the sanctions give a pressure on North Korean economy in the sense there is the effectiveness of the sanctions. That in order to avoid the sanctions, and the North Korea actually have the collaboration with the China through various measures, and North Korea want to avoid the effectiveness of sanctions. But still, there have been some pressures on North Korean economy from these international sanctions. So when we see the 2018 and 2019, and for about 2 years, there have been some the period North Korea could receive some impact from the sanctions. But after the 2020, due to the COVID-19 pandemics, North Korea closed its borders. So 2020, the year 2020, is a quite difficult time to make the judgment about the effectiveness. Then regarding the export, the 90% of the export has been reduced. But when it comes to the import, about 30% has been reduced. And in the North Korea, the tourism hasn't received any impact on the North Korean tourism, the industry. While tourism, the activities has been stopped, but that is not due to the sanctions, but by the COVID-19 pandemics. So, we market at the activities and productions and other the social the activities, we can look into those changes. And with international sanctions, it was difficult to have the export. That's why North Korean economy received negative impacts. And also regarding the capital, the markets, there has been some negative impact as well. And also regarding the agricultural activities, it was difficult to import the machineries. So it was the difficult situations. Well, North Korea is withstand this situation somewhat. There is no great natural disasters now. So even though the production the economic activities has been reduced, the North Korea can withstand these situations. But if a natural disaster occurs in the North Korea, it will be difficult to withstand these situations. So what I want to say is currently there is no grave natural disasters in North Korea. So somewhat North Korea is withstand the situation. But if North Korea have a natural disasters in some point, then there will be great impact from these international sanctions. The North Korea have a kind of adaptation to this the long-term the international sanctions. So the North Korea somewhat adjusted themselves to these the international sanctions, and also North Korea rely on the RMB, the economies rather than dollar economies. So North Korean economy is somewhat out of the supervision by United States. So the supervision and the powers that can be reduced so that the sanction can be tapering off as time goes. While the China have some measures to participate in this the international the effort. Now the international the sanctions effort is joined by the China. But if the COVID-19 pandemic deteriorates and China can restart is trading with North Korea, saying that this sanction gives the negative impact on humanitarian the situations. So now the China some participate and support these international sanctions, but if Chinese policy changes, it will be difficult to see the effectiveness of international sanctions. The professor, the Kevin the Gray said, so international the humanitarian support to the North Korea actually received the negative impact. That is due to the international sanctions and the U.S. The imposed sanctions. So if the transactions which exceed $30,000, then the money transfer cannot be made because the financial institutions do not want to have that transactions. So somewhat the North Korean economy receives some impact. But through some channels, the humanitarian aid has been given, and Tandong and the Daejeon port, and at those areas, there the humanitarian supply the materials and the goods. There have been some the negative impact from the humanitarian and from the international sanctions. So North Korea make an effort in order to have upper hand regarding the nuclear negotiations. So we need to look into this situation in very cautious manner. The international sanctions give negative impact on humanitarian situations in North Korea. That is one aspect. And also North Korea refused to take international support and humanitarian support, and which means that North Korea has the capabilities to withstand these international sanctions. So these international sanctions cannot have any positive effect. That there are some perspective like that. Well, the North Korea actually refused international humanitarian support, so people actually wonder whether North Korea has great capabilities to withstand these entire situations. And Professor Kevin Gray said, when it comes to the international sanctions, about 34% have the success, and the other the cases actually see the failures. And there is a question I'd like to ask to Professor Kevin Gray. So I believe we need to achieve the denuclearizations on the Korean Peninsula. But if a sanction is not viable options, and what is the way to resolve these nuclear issues? That is my first question. My second question is currently the COVID-19 gives bigger impact on North Korean economies. And actually North Korea closed its border in order to stop the spread of the pandemics. And North Korea has a kind of self-imposed isolations. And international community depose international sanctions, but rather than that has a great impact. The COVID-19 pandemic has a greater impact. Then what is the effectiveness of international sanctions? Then what is our next options to make North Korea change its behavior? So we just heard from the Professor Choi. Well, there are some perspective differences. The economic pressure that is given on North Korea, but whether it can be the primary target for the international sanctions, we need to think about that. So we need to have the objectives to change the behavior of North Korea, but the international sanction is not quite effective. So we need to have further discussions about that. So actually, Mr. Che raised two questions, and we are going to invite Kevin Gray later. So now we are going to invite Professor Kim Jong-yeon. So hello, I'm from Ewha Women's University. Well, Professor Kevin Gray, thank you for your insightful presentation. And we have discussions about the effectiveness of the sanctions against North Korea. So there are various the issues we need to discuss regarding effectiveness of this the international sanctions. What kind of the means we need to adopt in order to have better result out of these international sanctions? As Professor Kevin Gray mentioned in his presentation, and we can give impact regarding the changes of the behaviors. So primary target is the changing behaviors. So that was the kind of a framework to understand whether international sanction is viable or not. There have been multilateral sanctions, and also there have been unilateral sanctions. But when we see the North Korean situations, and actually North Korea did not drop its nuclear program. So from the perspective of a primary targets, I agree that this international sanction is a kind of a failure. But rather than we only focus on the nuclear program, so we can look into the other situations and surrounding the situations in order to evaluate the effectiveness of these international sanctions. So I believe it is important to find ways to enhance effectiveness of international sanctions based on these discussions. Even though international sanction is imposed on North Korea, kind of withstand the situations, then well, if we have that kind of discussions, we cannot find the next viable options. So we need to shift our the direction of discussions. And now we could not achieve the desirable outcomes, but we can intensify this the international sanctions. That can be one options, and also we can change the directions for the international the sanctions. And I believe United States is a key player. The United States is a kind of a sender state regarding this international sanctions. When you see the report from the Treasury Department, now we can see that there is the discussion that this international the sanction direction should be changed, because that gives a negative impact on the humanitarian situations. In order to have a legitimacy, it is important to change the directions in order to show America is back. It is crucial to address the directions of international sanctions. So this international sanction is required in order to change the behavior of North Korea, but the directions and the approaches should be changed, and also the South Korea can join this effort as well. And I agree that this international sanction is unnecessary, but still, under this international sanction, North Korea actually withstand these situations. And this international sanction somewhat distorted North Korean economies, and I agree with that. But when I see the North Korean situations, there is the dire situation regarding humanitarian situations. International the community regard this the difficult humanitarian situation as the price for the nuclear programs. But anyhow, we need to shift our attentions and regarding international sanctions so that we can have a better outcomes. We need to persuade the international communities in order to have the better outcomes out of international sanctions, and also have a better the result regarding humanitarian situations. As the Mr. Che mentioned, there have been some humanitarian activities in the North Korea, and due to this COVID-19 situation and other the negotiation, North Korea is somewhat refused to take this international support. So what is the implication we can have from such a North Korean act? We need to think about that. Internally, United States also have some kind of discussions about the effectiveness of international sanctions. Review report has been reported from Treasury departments, but some people said that there is no big differences before and after this the report presented by the Treasury Department. But rather than we only talk about the negative aspects, we need to shift our attentions and our discussions in order to find viable options, so that we can expand humanitarian aid to North Korea and also have a better the outcomes out of these international sanctions. When I see the literacies and other report presented, many the researchers, I believe that we need to have a broad perspective. Some the North Korean nuclear issues and international cooperations, and also inter-Korean cooperations. There are many things we need to consider in this context. If we only have the narrow perspective, it is difficult to see the big forest. We only look into the trees, so we cannot have good outcomes. So we need to find a viable the options to have the result we intended from this international sanctions. Otherwise, we cannot make great changes. So international the effort should be made, and also we need to make effort in order to persuade the international community. So let's go back to the United States. The United States is making effort in order to have international sanctions, and also the multilateral the approaches and multilateral framework has been adopted by United States. That is the positive sign. So rather than unilateral implementation of such sanctions, and the United States have the multilateral framework, that is the encouraging sign. But this North Korean, the issues and North Korean sanction, that is not the policy priority. So when you see the policy agendas developed by United States, it is difficult to see the North Korea and the North Korean sanctions because those are not the top priority of United States. In the past, we had the nuclear, the issues that was the main topics, but now the landscape has been changed and that has been evolved. When you see the newspapers, and actually there are many issues like the Sino-United States and the conflict, and also Korea and Japan relations, and we need to look into all these different the landscapes and the relations. And in the past, we only look into the nuclear programs, and so landscape was quite simple, but now we have a complicated the landscapes. So in coming years, in order to solve the North Korean the issues, we need to have the broad approaches. Now international sanction is regarded and evaluated as a somewhat failure. Then why should we discuss further in order to make the changes in these situations? Even though I did not include this in my paper, but I'd like to actually add this. Dr. Dresner actually wrote an article in Foreign Affairs. International sanctions has been strengthened on the North Korea, but there is it is because there is no other options. So regarding the international sanctions, and there should be different approaches. There should be monitorings, and there should be the reviews about the international sanction, the programs implemented. So the effectiveness of the international sanctions should be evaluated, and if the sanctions is not viable, then the sunset clause should be included. So that's what he suggested in this paper. So what I want to say is we need to develop our policies in order to find the viable outcomes. So this is all from me. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. Well, that was the great discussions. So, as a Professor Kim said, the Dr. Dresner wrote very meaningful the paper, and we wanted to invite him as the word speaker, but actually, he said he's engaged in the teaching, so it is difficult to participate. So, and his paper draws a lot of attention, and we are going to translate his paper. So if you need the paper, please do contact us. In the second session, and we are going to have a discussions about the humanitarian aid. So, we are not going to cover humanitarian aid in this first session. So now, Kevin and Gray, actually, his time is 1 a.m., very late night. So we are going to invite Professor Kevin Gray again. Please share your ideas regarding the panel discussions.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I agree with most of what's been said. I don't think there's any point of major disagreement. I'll try to address the questions, particularly posed by Choi Jang-ho, but I think they also relate to the second discussant, Kim Jong-un. I mean, the first one is about basically how to solve the issue, right? Which I think is the most difficult question. I don't have a perfect answer to that. I mean, obviously, this issue of North Korea's nuclear weapons is not going to go away for North Korea's neighbors or for the United States. I mean, I think the problem is that North Korea has made this decision that it believes that its nuclear weapons are absolutely, the ultimate guarantee of national survival. And in a way, when they're comparing their experience to Libya and other places, and they're not perhaps entirely unjustified in thinking that. In that respect, I think that the approach, particularly taken by the United States, of a kind of upfront denuclearization, drop your nuclear weapons, then we'll talk, I think that's kind of a non-starter. So I think, first of all, denuclearization has to be a much kind of longer term goal, but with steps towards that. And also on that note, I think also this idea that there can be some kind of trade-off, the offer of trade and investment in return for North Korea's denuclearization. I mean, I'm somewhat skeptical that North Korea would really take that up in the short to medium term. I think the only way forward is to try to facilitate a much longer term process of socio-economic change within North Korea through engagement, which will potentially lead to some form of political change much further down the line. So as a kind of long-term goal and as a way of nudging North Korea towards a form of reformed socialism in the sense, that China or Vietnam is. Whatever we think about China now, for example, it's still a very different society than it was in the 1970s. And despite the emerging competition with the US, it's still much more of a responsible stakeholder in the international system. But of course, the opportunities that were offered to China in the 1970s are not the ones that are being offered to North Korea now. North Korea now is expected to abandon immediately the kind of very cornerstone of its deterrence. So I'm not suggesting to abandon the goal of denuclearization of North Korea or of the Korean Peninsula, but I think there certainly needs to be a managing of expectations, and the economic engagement with North Korea will feed into this, the changes that are already taking place, which is internal marketization, but which is linked to the its international trade with China. These are kind of parts of the same process. So I think a process of engagement is kind of really important there. And with regards to COVID-19, I mean, of course, North Korea now is in sort of absolute crisis management mode. And I think North Korea has maintained its closed borders for much longer than many people and myself expected could be possible. And I think in one sense, it shows what the lengths that the North Korean state or government will go to in order to protect its system against what it regards as a kind of existential threat. Understanding that, of course, North Korea has a kind of a not very strong healthcare sector, which has experienced a crisis along with its broader economic crisis, and a population that has malnutrition and all these kind of things. I mean, the impacts of epidemics can vary greatly according to the socioeconomic conditions of a particular country. But I think it shows that the fact that this is kind of in a way self-imposed shows that North Korea can withstand, in a kind of political sense, a great deal of hardship. So yes. I mean, I think, but it's obviously a real challenge. It's which is not entirely disconnected from the issue of sanctions. If we understand sanctions to be also impacting healthcare in the country, then that also affects its resilience towards pandemics. But yes, I think I'll leave it there because I probably have maybe going over my time. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. So the professor, the Kevin Gray, was supposed to come to Korea after this seminar, but due to the spread of the variant Omicron, actually his the visit was cancelled. I sincerely hope that we can have an in-person the discussions later. So once again, I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Professor Kevin Gray and two panelists. So we are going to make the arrangement for the next session, and we are going to have a 5-minute break. So this is the end of the first session. Thank you.
제 2세션은
we're going to begin the session number 2. The session number 2 is on the effects of international sanctions on North Korean economy and the humanitarian aid. And mostly it will be about the humanitarian conditions and the inter-Korean cooperation, how it is affecting the North Korean relationship and their conditions. And now from Washington, Professor Ki Park will have a presentation, and Director Chung and Secretary General Lee will have discussion. So 20 minutes for the presentation and 10 minutes each for discussion. So we will first hear from Ki Park, professor from the Harvard Medical School. So he is the North Korean Program Director of the Korean American Medical Association. Hello. Hello. Good morning. Shall we start?
네, 시작해 주시면 됩니다.
Yes, please. 20 minutes.
Yes. First of all, let me just say thank you to Chairman Kang. I'm a big admirer of him and his organization, SONOSO. And this is an important topic. And so thanks for organizing this wonderful seminar. And I really learned a lot from the previous speakers on the economic impact of sanctions. And this session, as you pointed out, is about the humanitarian impact. And I will have a slightly different approach and not so much discussing on the actual impact of the sanctions, but some of the forces that are controlling the sanctions. And I think there might be some pathways out of it. So the outline of the talk is first, I want to talk a little bit about who are the main actors, their interests and their strategies in achieving their interests. And then talk about who is responsible for the population of North Korea. And then the impact of US's hostile policies. And then and then I want to go back to US. I'm a US citizen, even though I'm Korean, and then talk about present day, and then some recommendations for ROK at least on the humanitarian sector as it regards to the sanctions. So this is not obviously something that's really written down in stone, but this is my perception, and please take it as is. So North Korea, in my opinion, their main interest is security, national security, and regime survival. And I think this is more important to them than economic development. And we see this now with the COVID-19. They went into a shutdown knowing it will have massive implications on their economy, but they prioritize regime survival and national security. And their strategy prior to the pandemic is really to defense, invest in the strong military, and hence the program, the nuclear and the ballistic missile program. Now, if you look at the US prioritizes US's national security. And to me, they have prioritized security over peace. And I'll tell you what I mean by that, because security and peace really are the two sides of the same coin. And because we all want, at the end of the day, peace. But US's strategy is really through pressure. Whether it's military pressure, economic pressure, and now we're talking today about sanctions. And North Korea calls them hostile policies, and we all know that. But that's, but it's the same thing in the US's eyes. It's the US's maximum pressure strategy to try to convince North Korea to give up their nuclear weapons, right? And that's the pathway to peace, by having North Korea give up their what they consider really their only insurance against invasion. And then for South Korea, it depends on the regime and the government in power, I think. But right now, Moon Jae-in administration prioritizes peace. And this is sort of his flagship objective. And inter-Korea cooperation. At the end of the day, Korea is one people. And people in North Korea are Korean people. Sometimes they're actually family members. So it's important for people in South Korea. They have a sense of kinship, and they want to help those that's less fortunate on the other side of the demilitarized zone. And South Korea also wants to develop economically, and it has done that in a spectacular way. But their strategy is engagement and diplomacy. For instance, right now, the big push is for the end of war declaration. Now, US, even though they want peace at the end, doesn't support right now outrightly end of war declaration because it doesn't jive. It's not in alignment with their pressure tactic. They see this as sort of a gift, to the North Koreans. And then for South Korea, there is a certain amount of US ROK cooperation. It is something that they have done for decades and they continue to do. And this is becoming problematic, especially in the humanitarian space. And I'll get a little bit into it in a bit. So let's talk about humanitarian space and what do the interests mean for the three main actors. For North Korea, the actual provision of humanitarian aid by international actors, they're ambivalent. They're not desperate for humanitarian aid. And I'll tell you why. Currently, the amount of aid that gets into North Korea pre-pandemic, before they shut down their borders, was around $30 million a year. That's about $1 per person per year. This is not really that a dramatic type of aid that North Korea will prioritize. But in response to having international aid workers in the country, it is a big administrative burden for them. So at some point, the paltry amount of international aid, humanitarian aid, may no longer justify allowing the international staff to be in country. And in fact, you saw that with the COVID-19, all the international staff left, and North Korea is not desperate to have them come back. So I think from a humanitarian aid point of view, North Korea is take it or leave it. They're not desperate for aid. And also, there's this philosophy of juche. They don't like handouts. And no one likes handouts from a pride standpoint. North Korea prefers more solidarity. For instance, they would rather co-finance projects rather than be a recipient of aid. They don't want to be beggars, and they don't need to be beggars. In fact, they have co-financed vaccines for decades with the Global Alliance for Vaccination. They don't mind paying for things that they need. And then, of course, the current sanctions directly impact the ability of North Korean government to take care of their people. Not only does it cripple their economy, as we just saw in the last session, but it also prevents North Korea from importing parts for their medical equipment, sometimes medicine themselves, some raw material, joint ventures with medical pharmaceutical companies, all kinds of issues as far as taking care of their health needs of the North Korean people. Now, from a humanitarian aid standpoint, South Korea is in a very interesting position. I think South Korea is conflicted on one hand by the desire to assist North Korean people, right? Because we have this, the kinship with them. But at the same time, they're shackled by this ironclad ROK-US alliance. And then the US expects pressure. So here we have this really mutually exclusive objectives. One is engagement. The other one says, no, we need to apply pressure. And South Korea tends to respect the international rule of law, including UN Security Council sanctions. Now, we'll note that China and Russia have openly flouted the sanctions and to help North Korea. And they're both members of the United Nations as well. Now, on the US side, there's been some shifts. First of all, it's no doubt that US has offered humanitarian assistance to North Korea. From North Korea's side, they don't like to take aid from those who are actually sending sanctions because they said, just remove the sanctions, we can take care of ourselves, right? So they're causing these sanctions and saying, oh, let us give you some humanitarian assistance. It's something that they just don't like. And because of the pandemic, the US has become increasingly defensive about the unintended impact of sanctions. Now, I would like to just point out that this phrase, unintended, the consequences of sanctions, I think we should point that out, that particular phrase is probably a well-crafted propaganda. We should not use unintended consequences because they're intended. They know what these sanctions will do. And when they put in unintended consequences, it really says, well, we're not really meaning to do any harm, but it happens anyway. They know. So this is the main stakeholders as far as humanitarian aid goes and their interests. So there's this narrative, who is actually responsible for the population, the vulnerable population of North Korea? So I will tell you, North Korea actually takes full responsibility for its population. Now, at least as far as the health is concerned, but economic sanctions are preventing them. As I mentioned, they abhor offers of aid from those who are actually sending these economic sanctions. To them, they're saying, let's remove the sanctions in the first place. We're happy to take care of our own. I will tell you, in the health sector, North Korea has maintained, from best of our estimates, their public spending on health around 6.5% of GDP every year, despite the increases in their military spending, and despite international sanctions. And they have developed their own CT scanner. They've developed their own artificial knee joints, despite the sanctions. So there's clear evidence in my mind that North Korea continues to invest in the health of their people. Now, U.S.'s narrative is North Korea will divert funds from humanitarian aid and use it to prop up the regime. Or the U.S. is also saying, why doesn't North Korea use their weapons program money and then use it to feed their people? And that justifies economic sanctions. And I think we have to be careful that we don't allow this kind of narrative to continue, because North Korea, I think, is doing the best they can. They can do more, but they can, in the context of current unfinished war on the Korean Peninsula. I would also say that Japan is pretty clear that their position is, let's cut off humanitarian aid to North Korea. And I know from personal sources that they were the ones that led the Global Fund to cut off their funding for a TB medication program in North Korea in 2018. And this was at the peak of the maximal pressure era in 2018. And US backed that, but it was Japan-led. US went along with it, and then Global Fund pulled out of their North Korea, $10 million a year, about 100,000 people that were on life-saving tuberculosis medications. There's a happy ending to that, in that they did restore the funding a year later. Now, from the ROK side, as I mentioned before, there's that sense of kinship. This is our people that we need to take care of. So let's talk about US's hostile policies. It's the harshest sanctions in history. There's a banking channel currently that's not working at the moment. It's cutting off humanitarian aid funding and affects humanitarian aid and North Korea's ability to care for its people. So let's get to the U.S. domestic politics. U.S. is somewhat split on how they see the U.S. should approach North Korea, especially humanitarian situation. On one hand, this is an op-ed that I wrote and said, hunger in North Korea is devastating and it's our fault. And this was a direct response to the elevating sanctions in 2017. And this was in the New York Times, and they published it. This is on the right side, an opinion piece from Gordon Chang. And Newsweek published this 1 week ago. And what he said was, we should not give food aid to North Korea because it props up the regime, and that regime will starve its own people. So this is, Newsweek is a very well-respected media outlet here in the US, but you can see that you have voices on opposite sides, and it's actually very split down. Now, what's happening in the Capitol Hill? Very interesting. We have representatives like Brad Sherman from California, who actually sent the letter to the President of the United States, signed a letter saying we should end the war on North Korea, right? And then he had to sign with 22 of his colleagues from Congress. And that was sent in November 8th of just last month. Just last week, Representative Young Kim, who's a Republican, she and 34 of her colleagues signed a letter telling the Biden administration not to declare the war over because it's a gift for the North Korean regime. So you can see the politics in the US playing out. However, the voice in favor of peace, favor of humanitarian aid, I think is getting louder and louder, and we're building momentum. So, we have published from our research lab things where we estimate the number of people that we think could have died as a result of sanctions in North Korea. That was run by Wall Street Journal, which is a conservative newspaper. There's a number of op-eds that we've been writing, opinion pieces that says that we need to do something about these sanctions because it's killing and harming innocent people, women and children. There are senators who are introducing bills to make sure that humanitarian aid is continued despite these sanctions. So the Senator Markey and Representative Levin are leading that process. And then, of course, 2 years ago, the pandemic hit. And these sanctions were never designed to operate in the pandemic era. And to ask for permission to send PPEs and testing equipment, that's the current mechanism for getting humanitarian exemptions. That makes no sense, but that's still in process. And we pointed that out to the US government. So US government in response, instead of opening up their exemptions process and saying it's okay and we'll just give a general license, they responded by saying they will expedite requests quickly, but I think that still it doesn't make any sense. As I mentioned earlier, the Global Fund did go back to North Korea, almost a $42 million grant for tuberculosis and malaria work, which is finally, there was pressure from Japan and US. Global Fund relented, but then they came back and said, we're going back in, which is the right thing to do. And this was from pressure from civil society groups like myself. So I'm going to end with some recommendations for South Korea, because I think this event is really happening for the audience, South Korean audience, and I'm going to be a little bit controversial. I hope that's okay with you. So I would say ROK should consider decoupling humanitarian aid for North Korea from US ROK alliance. And I'll tell you what that means. I'm not saying get rid of US ROK alliance, period. That's not what I'm saying. The military alliance, political alliance, they all stay. But in areas of humanitarian assistance, there should be a decoupling, because it's complete. Their the interests and strategies are conflicting. And I would say ROK could generously fund the appeals from UN agencies and NGOs that work inside North Korea. They can actually play a leadership role and convince allies, other countries, to increase humanitarian aid funding, use their soft power, use their diplomacy. They can even insist that North Korea receive its fair share of international aid. As I mentioned before, they get $1 per person per year. You look at Vietnam, which is far richer, they get $80, $90 per person per year of international assistance. Why should that be? And then we should lead the effort, South Korea can lead the effort to challenge the harmful effect of sanctions, not just talk about it, but really effort to modify the system that's in place at the UN, international unilateral coercive actions, and fix this problem once and for all. And in conclusion, I mean, we don't need permission to help our fellow Koreans. We should never have to ask that from anyone. These are our people. We want to help them. We should never have to ask for permission. Thank you very much.
네.
Thank you very much, Professor Park. It's really interesting and also very helpful. And thank you for saving our time, like a couple of minutes. Thank you very much for your great presentation. So let's move on to the discussion. First, we will hear from Director Jung Dae-jin, Peace Center, Han Peace Institute, please. 10 minutes. Thank you, Professor Park, for your great presentation. I think my comments will be very similar. As we know, the sanctions against North Korea is a case in point that represents the peculiarities of inter-Korean relation and universality of international relations manifesting themselves on the Korean Peninsula. While the ROK tends to interpret and impose the sanctions against North Korea on the level of their purposiveness in the view of the peculiarities of inter-Korean relations, international community, including the U.S., and also tend to focus on strict implementation and the effectiveness of the sanctions on the level of the legal certainty. So that's the stance of Republic of Korea. But the U.S. look into this whole unique features and the legal certainty of the sanctions. So that's really creating tensions. So in this regard, I think the U.S. hold a key here and what they think and what's their take and how we can leverage that in a way that doesn't create any conflicts and tensions, and we can operate or implement the sanctions as it was, or to fit its purpose. So what about the U.S. now? So one key parameter was the Treasury review that came out October, and I watched the video in the Congress, and it's not like it doesn't seem that it's been welcomed by the U.S. And for 9 months they reviewed, and it was kind of degenerate, and the bipartisan position was that it was not really much of a big deal. And when you think about these sanctions on North Korea, we expect to the sanctions to fulfill the purpose. However, from both sides of the Congress, they want to enhance the sanctions against North Korea. So the U.S. is now holding the key here to solve the problem. So how can we reconcile that or align that in ROK? So we need to look into this and what's going on, and responses and feedback from the U.S. Well, the humanitarian crisis should be prevented, and for that, the U.S. also cares about that. After the Treasury review, I looked into the conversations coming out in the U.S., and they want to modernize the sanctions. For example, they want to build the infrastructure and digital. That's also one focus. And also, for the sanctions, there are the other negative impacts on like the humanitarian crisis, and they want to prevent that. And that's another thing that was highlighted. So the sanctions should meet the essential needs of the people, and the whole purpose of the sanctions is not to do that. And the legal humanitarian aid also in line with the values that are upheld by the United States, and they want to show that and demonstrate that to the world. So given this perspective, the South Korea has joined the international community for the sanctions and the inter-Korean dialogue, and trying to build mutual trust and grasp opportunities for cooperation in an effort to set in motion a virtuous cycle of denuclearization, peace regime, and improvement in inter-Korean relations. So the peace and democracy need to be upheld, and the U.S. is playing a role. We agree to that. But also, we need to take a smart and flexible approach to the sanctions to North Korea, and we need to make change so that we can be creative and flexible in changing the behaviors of North Korea. That also needs to be emphasized. And the Treasury review this time, it also emphasized this negative correlation between the sanctions and the humanitarian crisis. So to fix that, the U.S. Need to think about the effectiveness and the whole purpose of the sanctions. And also the ally, the ROK, will do its part. That was also announced. And the North Korean humanitarian crisis is also attributed to, or is caused by the sanctions against North Korea, and that should be also highlighted. But indeed, in reality, it's not really easy to relax these sanctions. So as we review the sanctions, we may keep it for a while, but we should make sure that it doesn't affect the humanitarian aid by having close conversation with the United States in the meantime. And as a part of that, the end of the war declaration has been mentioned, but when you look at that in reality, it's not really that feasible. And for North Korea, for example, the trigger for the U.S.-North Korean dialogue, we want to use that, but North Korea doesn't see much benefit that they can get out of the declaration. So, well, whether they will change or whether they will have a new perspective in terms of the dialogue, well, maybe not. The declaration may mean something, but it's too premature. And also, it may not be able to be used as a trigger for the DPRK-U.S. dialogue. So we need more practical solutions for the dialogue. For example, we may open up a liaison office, but that also has some political symbol, and we need to also work on the different interests, and that would not happen in the short term. And on the other aspect, the USAID office opening in Pyongyang, for example, for the humanitarian aid, the U.S., not just North Korea, they are imposing these sanctions in North Korea. And with these whole sanctions from the U.S. and the international community, they don't want to be blamed for any humanitarian crisis. So opening up an USAID office in North Korea can be one thing, and they can open up the channel for the cooperation and the further dialogue, and they can look into the opportunities for further cooperation. So that proposal can be one good way for them and to make a breakthrough. And when Professor Park make a comments later, I would like to hear your thoughts on the feedback or the public opinion in the U.S. So with this whole recommendations to the U.S. and to operate the whole programs, it's also important, but we need to also make some changes in Korea. We are sending out the medical supplies and helping them to modernize their farming communities, and we are working hard for the humanitarian aid. But in terms of the vitamin cannot be sent to the North Korea because of this whole strategic materials, because it can be used as a trigger to develop the nuclear materials. So vitamins cannot be sent to the North Korea, or people are now very cautious and careful. So I'm not sure whether how many million tons are being sent to the U.S. Or North Korea, but still, anyway, we are too much sensitive and too much careful about sending out this one. So they had the 6 nuclear tests in North Korea, and we couldn't stop that. We know that. But sending out vitamins, they are on the strategic material watch list, and we are too much careful about sending out this whole vitamins. Well, we should ask that ourselves as well. So that's it for my discussion.
감사합니다.
Well, thank you. That was quite the interesting suggestion. So the U.S. government can give actually unconditional the offers for the negotiations and unconditional cooperation. What is the actual meaning of that? So U.S. aid and the U.S. government, and actually they have the various programs like the vaccine programs. So the North Korea will fully understand the intention of the United States if those programs are really implemented. And also regarding humanitarian aid and inter-Korean relations should be further improved. So for the next the question and the discussions, and we are going to invite Mr. Lee Ju-sung. He is a Secretary General of the Korea NGO Council for Cooperation with North Korea. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Lee Ju-sung, as introduced, and it's very nice to meet Professor Park-ki. You give the innovative and creative ideas all the time. So thank you so much. I'd like to extend my sincere gratitude to Director Chung Dae-jin as well. Thank you for sharing your insightful ideas. As the Professor Park-ki said, the North Korea has the survival issues. So in order to resolve these survival issues, and as insurance, the nuclear program is necessary to North Korean regime. But with the single nuclear program alone, the North Korea cannot survive. They cannot guarantee their survival. So in the diplomatic scenes and the political scene, the nuclear program can be negotiation tools. But when it comes to the support from the North Korean people, the other tools are required. That's why Mr. Kim Jong-un will make the various efforts in order to win the heart of North Korean people. So various policies have been implemented. And ever since 2010, the landscape in North Korea has been changed greatly. And in the year 2014, there was a suggestion from North Korea. So the humanitarian cooperation can be made between South and North Korea Korea that was offered made by North Korea in the year 2014, and also international, the inter-Korean cooperation, the business cooperation can be made. As Professor Park said, the North Korea does not want to receive the unilateral aid, and actually North Korea want to have a joint project and the joint programs in order to develop their own economies. And that is quite encouraging. For the last 25 years, there have been the unilateral aid from Korea and international community. So there has been some fatigue regarding this. But actually North Korea want to have the joint project and joint programs rather than being a receiving end regarding international aid. So there can be the possibility for collaborations and cooperations with the North Korea and the international community, and also the inter-Korean cooperation can give a positive signal to NGOs who made effort in order to support North Korea. But the North Korean sanctions, that becomes the stumbling block in this process. So the North Korean nuclear program gives a threat to the peace of international society. That's why international sanction has been imposed. But still, we do not have a viable outcomes out of that. We cannot just ask the responsibility to North Korea. So in the past, when we met the officials from the North Korea, what they said is actually international sanctions give some negative impact on North Korean economy, but it is important to have international cooperation, so the North Korea can have the foundations to stand by themselves. As a member of the international community, North Korea want to bear its own responsibility. That's what the officials from North Korea mentioned a few years ago when I met them. So, South Korea and the United States have the close the alliance, and actually we are on the nuclear umbrella, designed by United States. The nuclear weapons developed by the North Korea, that is a great threat to us, but we can actually make some changes. So, North Korea want to develop their own economies through the joint programs. So we should go beyond these international sanctions. And North Korea want to make some changes in their economic situations. That's why North Korea came to the negotiation table in the Hanoi. But there was no deal from the Hanoi summit. That's why that gave the North Korea received a negative impact. So international sanctions want to give some negative impact on target country. So it is to penalize the target country. So the international society and the United States actually have been set the sanctions. But in the process of international sanctions, the women's and the children's, those innocent people, they receive the negative impact indeed. So as we had the discussions in the first session, before we talk about the effectiveness of international sanctions, we need to think about the international the humanitarian situations, because the innocent people the badly impacted from international sanctions. When you see humanitarian situations in North Korea, do we have to impose these international sanctions in continuous way? We should have the very cautious approaches regarding that. We cannot prove that, but the officials from the North Korea, and they share some information, so we can get some glimpse about North Korean situations. North Korea has the difficult situations, and also we cannot guarantee this information 100%, but according to some sources, there the hunger in the North Korea, and some actually die from hunger. So this is not quite the time which fix the food shortages, but there the news about that. So we need to take a very cautious approaches regarding North Korean situations. So the North Korean situation deteriorated, and that the situation is accelerated. That's why the NGOs and other civic groups take this situation very seriously, and we attentively watch what is going on in North Korea. The international sanction is not only on the North Korea, and these NGOs' activities has been restricted from these international sanctions. Well, the fundings and other the activities cannot be made for the North Korea. Well, there are various opinions regarding North Korean and the aid in these situations. But anyhow, due to international sanctions, the NGOs lost its engines for its activities, which is a very negative impact. So the universal values and mutual coexistence and those the key ideas pursued by NGO, the civic groups, but under these international sanctions, NGOs are losing its momentum and its the engines for activities. And also, it is important to build trust and confidence. In order to build trust and confidence, it is crucial to have the aid and assistance programs. Based on this, we have the better opportunities to build trust and confidence. But due to the international sanctions, we just lose the opportunities to build such the trust. Some the cooperative farms participated in order to have this the inter-Korean cooperations, but due to international sanctions, this cooperative farm program has been stopped. If we go back to North Korea in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, if we offer to resume our cooperation to cooperative farms, and it will not be easy. So the North Korea is the socialist country, so the organizations and individuals who involved in the international aid programs, they actually removed from the support the list from the North Korean government. So actually the cooperative farms have chosen to have international programs, so they could not receive the support from the North Korean government. So in that situation, in order to survive, in order to support this the cooperative farms and the relevant people, the international community and the South Korea should make great effort in order to keep the promise so that they can survive. But international community and the South Korea does not keep their promise, then and cooperative farms and the other organizations who decide to have international programs in the North Korea have a very difficult situation. Public and private cooperation is crucial to provide support to North Korea. The trust and the confidence should be built on the private level first, and that can keep the momentum to have the public and government level the cooperations. If there is no trust and no confidence on this human-to-human relations, then on the government level, it is even more difficult to build close relations and build trust and confidence. We need to make the positive contributions based on these the exchanges. Because international sanctions give a negative impact on building trust and confidence, that is a very unfortunate situations. So what I think is, the international sanctions against North Korea has some justifications and legitimacy, but I sincerely hope that this international sanction should not give a negative impact on innocent people like children and women, and also there should be decoupling between the aid and also the political the effort. And the Korean government and also NGOs in Korea should play leaderships in order to change the situations. The information should be changed and should make a continuous effort. And also based on the various the programs and the effort, the NGOs in South Korea should make effort in order to change North Korea. The North Korean NGOs and South Korean NGOs and they can have the exchanges, and I want to make a few suggestions. There is a pending issues that is the COVID-19 pandemic. It is crucial to provide the vaccines to North Korea. I'd like to actually ask a question to Professor Park Ki. So this COVID pandemic giving impact on the international community. Rather than we provide just the one-time the aid. So this COVID pandemics and climate changes, the international issues. So the health issues and also this climate change issues, and those the common challenges faced by all of us. So we need to find the better options. So in order to safeguard ourselves, we need to provide the health support to North Korea. We need to provide the vaccines to North Korea. So why should we be prepared? What is the proper options to support North Korea regarding that? So you the experts in health at the scenes, what is your suggestions then? Well, thank you so much. So we just heard from Secretary General Lee Joo-sung. Now, I also participated in the NGO activities to support North Korea. So there are great difficulties, UN sanctions and COVID-19, and also the economic difficulties. And North Korea have the three different challenges at the same time. So in these international sanctions, and NGOs and civic groups and lose their momentums to support North Korea, and also the trust and the confidence, and those have been broke down because there is no exchanges. So actually, we have a great the problems in the international the arena. So for the last the 4 years, we wanted to make some changes, but we are nearly the end of these administrations. So anyhow, we are going to invite Professor Park Ki again. So if you have any the comments, please do share with us.
So Chairman Kang, let me just comment on Director Dae-jin Jung's proposal, specifically as it relates to the U.S. government involvement in humanitarian aid, and specifically the USAID, perhaps opening up a liaison office or some branch office in North Korea. That's a really interesting concept because the USAID has been moved up. The USAID administrator, Samantha Power, is now part of the National Security Council. So even though it's administered within a State Department, her position, so international aid, is now considered part of the National Security Council agenda. So it's a very creative solution. I think it's an interesting idea worth exploring. Then the other question is from Secretary General Joo-sung Lee about vaccines in North Korea. So one of the things that we were able to find out is the actual capabilities of North Korean government in deploying vaccines. And they're able to deploy at times as many as 3 million injections a day. They did this about a dozen years ago for the measles outbreak, and they had a nationwide vaccination campaign. What that means is that they're actually able to deploy the mRNA vaccines, the Moderna or the Pfizer vaccine, which have the highest safety profile and efficacy profile. So before, the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were not really an option for North Korea. They talked about AstraZeneca and the Sinovac, but I think there's a certain amount of vaccine hesitancy within North Korea. And I think it's worthwhile offering North Korea the mRNA vaccine, either Moderna or the Pfizer, through the COVAX advanced market commitment mechanism. Now, that only provides 20% of the population with subsidized vaccines. I think it's also time to evaluate the entire package. Maybe as many as 50 to 60 million doses of vaccine, perhaps Moderna, perhaps Pfizer, for the entire population of North Korea. I think they need to be assured that they will be able to vaccinate the entire population, and I think they will get their attention.
예, 우리
So, well, Professor Paki actually shared his insightful ideas. So, thank you so much. So, the North Korean the population can have the herd immunities by having these the vaccinations. So, the support is required as a humanitarian issues from the perspective of North Korea. But well, rather than we only focus on that, we also have a broad the perspective. So, based on this effort, the inter-Korean and the North Korea, the United States relations can be developed further. So, the Professor Paki, your time is at 10 p.m. So, thank you so much for joining us. So, we need to have a short break in order to prepare the next session. So, well, at 10:55, we are going to resume our discussions. Once again, my sincere thanks go to Paki. Good night.
예,
So welcome back. We are now having this international seminar on sanctions against North Korea, co-hosted by the SONOSA and the national member Lee Yong-sun. The session number 3 will be from the legal perspective. So we have 3 lawyers. First, the presenter will be Mr. David Wolf, and we have the 2 discussants, Mr. Kwon Sunyap and Kim Se-jin. So we have like a 35 minutes, and like the other previous sessions, so 20 minutes for presentation, and then we will have like a 10 minutes each for the discussion. So Mr. Wolf, are you there? Please start your presentation.
Good morning, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. It's a real privilege. Thank you, Chairman Kang. Thank you to the South-North Cooperation Association. I'm sorry that we cannot do this in person. I would actually at this point love to be able to and be allowed to leave the country. So hopefully next year we can do this in person. I also want to thank the previous presenters, the previous panelists. I learned a lot on the impacts on the both economic side. So thank you to Professor Gray, and then on the humanitarian side to Dr. Park and the panel. It's also an honor today to share the stage with a few colleagues from 2 Korean firms. First, Lawyer Kim, it's a pleasure. I remember meeting you in DC and back again in Korea. I look forward to that again. And then Mr. Kwon, while we have not worked together directly, I've worked with many of your colleagues at Lee & Co, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts later. So what we'll be doing on this panel is a little bit different than the previous panels. The previous panels talked about the effects. We'll be giving a little bit more of the legal background and underpinning. A lot of that has already come out. And so I will hopefully be able to move through these slides more quickly, and hopefully be able to leave a little bit of room for question and answer and feedback from the co-panelists. First, 2 initial caveats. I always have to offer this up when describing US sanctions. I'm going to be talking about what the rules are. I didn't make them. So we're not going to speak about what I think they should be. And I'll defer to the other panelists for that and the previous panels. This is just a description, so we're all starting from the same place. So in order to do that, there we go. What I'm going to do is talk first very briefly about the UN structure, because it underpins all of both the US sanctions, the Korean sanctions, even the Chinese and Russian sanctions. So do an overview of that program, and then spend a little bit more time on the US side. As we've heard from the previous panelists, it is often the US sanctions that are driving behavior and that are both causing consequence in North Korea, but that are driving decisions from counterparties, whether they be humanitarian, commercial actors, banks, to decline to proceed. And so we'll spend some time on the US sanctions piece before wrapping up with conclusions and hopefully 2 to 3 kind of thoughts or key takeaways. Go ahead and jump straight into the UN side. So as you've already heard, there is a UN sanctions program on North Korea that is the broadest of the UN sanctions. It is not comprehensive. It, of course, does not prohibit all activity with North Korea, but it is broader than any other UN sanctions program on any other jurisdiction at this point. That's been true since the end of 2017, when the program was expanded several times in quick succession. The program, generally speaking, covers the prohibition on the export to North Korea of a number of items, most prominently and most relevant for those of us looking at this from a humanitarian perspective, items in certain customs codes. And for those of you with access to the presentation, I included an annex that actually lists all of those so that we cannot bother everybody by talking through them. But that ends up capturing virtually all medical equipment. doesn't capture medicine, but virtually all medical equipment ends up in a provision that it requires a UN level export license. As you saw, there's from the economic sides from Professor Gray, there's a broad set of restrictions on imports from North Korea that have had a sharp effect. You have seen a sharp curtailing of imports even prior to the pandemic. There's a set of sanctions on designated persons in North Korea from the UN perspective. It's about 150 persons in total, 80 individuals, 75 entities. And then a smattering of additional restrictions, everything from transactions with North Korean citizens working outside of North Korea, vessel-related inspection regimes, and financial restrictions and limitations on sort of correspondent account banking with North Korean banks. As I mentioned, it is not comprehensive, but it is the broadest program that exists today. So from a humanitarian perspective, the way to think about it, first, check and see if it fits within one of those prohibitions. If it's medicine or agricultural products and you don't have a sanctioned party, it might not. But if it's medical equipment, it almost certainly will. At which point, you actually need to ask the UN for an authorization. And this is administered by something called the 1718 Committee. They have an established process for enabling UN member state or nonprofit exemption requests from UN level sanctions. It is a cumbersome process, but it is a little bit more streamlined than it has been in previous years when we have spoken about UN level sanctions. And I just checked the website this morning. The committee now notes that it has granted 84 exemption requests since it has been stood up in, I believe it finally came around in late 2018. One other, the committee has also become a little bit more flexible over the course of the last 12 to 24 months. Previously, exemption requests were limited to a 6-month period of authorization. They have now extended that to a year, taking into account the COVID and travel restrictions. They've also, in at least one case, considered extending it up to 2 years. But it is absolutely a process that requires a formal written submission, review. But then if you're granted an exemption, it's posted on the website. So you can go to the website I've listed here to actually review any exemptions that have been granted to whether that's the Republic of Korea, whether that's a UNICEF or the UN body, whether that's independent nonprofits. That's the UN side. The US side is where it gets a little more controversial. To understand US restrictions on North Korea, you first have to understand the universe over which the United States thinks it can assert jurisdiction. So does the transaction involve a US person? Does it involve a US origin product? If the answer is yes to either of those questions, your transaction is almost certainly prohibited without a license. If the answer is no, you would think, great, we don't have to worry about US rules. Except unfortunately, the US administers something called a secondary sanctions program, in which even non-US persons could face sanctions risk for conducting activity. So to dig into that a little bit, US persons, all US citizens and permanent residents, if I moved to Seoul and spent the rest of my life there, I would continue to be a US person because I have a US citizenship. All US incorporated entities and their non-US branches, all persons in the United States. US origin product, everything that's here, everything that's ever been here, and even things that are made outside the US with more than a de minimis amount of controlled content. In effect, think a medical device that's manufactured in Korea with 10% or more US origin content. That jurisdictional reach is then interpreted incredibly broadly to capture any transaction that has a US person in it at all, whether that's the provision of US services, the provision of US financing, an approval from a US citizen, or most prominently, and as you heard earlier, virtually all transactions in US dollars, because they're processed through or clear through a US financial institution. If your transaction involves a US person or a US product, it is almost certainly prohibited to North Korea. US persons are prohibited to export any goods or services to, import any goods or services from, undertake any investment in, conduct any transactions with any person identified as sanctioned, which includes the government, or even to travel to North Korea without an authorization from the US government. So if the activity is subject to direct US jurisdiction, the only question you're really asking yourself is there a license here? Is there something here that authorizes me to do it? If the answer is there's no US jurisdictional reach, then the US still says, okay, I might be able to sanction you for doing it. These are secondary sanctions. And this is the broadest of the US secondary sanctions programs. It authorizes the designation of any person who is operating in certain sectors of the North Korean economy, who has engaged in a significant import to North Korea, or import from or export to, who has transacted or provided material support to a North Korean person. In other words, if it's a significant activity with North Korea, you could face sanctions risks for undertaking it. Which means in both contexts, you're always looking for a license. However, there are some. As Dr. Park mentioned, they're not nearly as broad as they could be, but there is general licenses for nonprofit. There are specific license authorizations from both OFAC, the sanctioning authority, and BIS, the commerce authority. And I will say they are cumbersome, but they work. And you probably do need lawyers to help you with it, but we regularly work with, and many of my peers in Washington and around the United States regularly work with humanitarian organizations to secure these licenses. And we have a number of clients who have them. So there is a way to get an authorization, but you have to usually ask, which is admittedly a cost and a time delay for the provision of humanitarian services. So a couple of key kind of conclusions and takeaways before I turn it over to the co-panelists. And stepping out of the sanctions themselves and just a kind of reaction to the earlier slides. First, as noted, there's been almost no change from a US perspective on North Korea sanctions over the course of the last year. That is itself remarkable. Every year before this, there had been at least some change. This year has been very much status quo. Second, I absolutely agree with the comments that to understand US sanctions, you have to understand US domestic politics. And this is usually the point where I apologize to the audience, because not only do you have to understand US domestic politics, you usually have to understand congressional politics and state level politics. But here, it is very, very challenging politically for an administration to unwind sanctions without having something to show for it. That might be the right answer from a foreign policy perspective. It almost certainly would be the right answer from a humanitarian perspective. But at heart, politicians are looking to their domestic audiences first. And it's very challenging because there's no votes in being soft on North Korea. That's how it would be perceived. And then finally, I would note, but this is a question I want to pose to my co-panelists from an impact side. I fully defer to the economic impact to the Professor Gray and his panelists, fully defer on the humanitarian impact to Dr. Park and the co-panelists. We, on the lawyer side, have a unique position where we work directly with often private sector companies, private sector banks, nonprofits directly on their compliance with these rules. And I can say these absolutely have the effect and the impact that everybody here has been talking about. So on the one side, humanitarian organizations can get licenses. We've talked about it. I've sat in all of the meetings with the 1718 committee. I've sat in the meetings with the US government. There is a receptivity there to processing activity. But on the other side, on the commercial side, as soon as I'm done with this conversation tonight, I'm going to go join a training program for a European-based financial institution and talk about their sanctions risk appetite, which is they won't touch North Korea-related activity, and they won't touch anybody who does North Korea activity, even if it's not through the bank, i.e., even a nonprofit who does North Korea-related activity. The financial sector is so risk-averse right now that they think that even if you do that through somebody else, the bank will not bank you. And that's a non-US bank. And so with that, I'd like to finish, but also pose a question to my co-panelists on what, if any, impact have you seen from your clients, and has that shifted over the course of the last 12 months? And do you expect maybe it to shift in the coming 12? So thank you again for the opportunity. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Mr. David Wolf. Well, these inter-Korean or the cooperation groups have our relationship goes back years to like 2017 or 18. We had this secondary sanctions. We were so surprised. We didn't know what to do. And SONOSA also was involved, but Dr. Wolf or Mr. Wolf helped us a lot about how to react that and to get the legal advice on that point. So I'd like to appreciate that. And thank you for sharing these UN and the US sanctions. And I think you made a great PR of your service. I hope you will have a great success with your company. So now we'll move on to the Korean lawyers side. First, from Lee and Go, or from Pae, Kim, and Lee, we have a lawyer, Kim Se-jin, 10 minutes.
Very nice to meet you again. And it was an excellent overview of the United States sanctions, as well as the UN sanction against North Korea. So when I browsed your slides and your presentation, I don't think there is any points that I need to re-emphasize again for further critiques or any other comments. So my focus today of my comment is about how the Korean citizens actually feel on their skin regarding the U.S. sanction, the application of the UN and U.S. sanction in the Korean Peninsula, in the soil. So because most of the audience of this broadcasting will be the Koreans, so from now on I will try to explain all of my comments in Korean. So sorry, so apology for some confusions to JD. So DJ. So 안녕하십니까.
Hello, good morning. So thank you for the presentation. In Korea, about the UN and US sanctions against North Korea, how they are being implemented, and what kind of Korean people having the impact from these sanctions. That's what I need to or want to talk about. So here you see first in Korea, my conclusion is that the UN and US sanctions are take most part of the Korean sanctions, and how they are implemented in the legal framework, it's a more complicated story. So basically the international law and foreign law are the basis of the sanctions against North Korea. And when it came to Korea, for example, the trade sanctions, we have this Foreign Trade Act and Foreign Exchange Transaction Act, and also the prohibition against the financing, and there are the Coastal Guard Act and the Immigration Act. There are so many laws which implement the sanctions against North Korea. So in this regard, the Korean sanctions, when you look at the Korean sanctions, it's it's a bit different, and you need to take a different approach when from what you take from the UN and US sanctions. So in the US, they have the SD and list. They have the list, and in Korea we have a similar thing. And unlike the US SD and list, when we designated these persons, we have a separate list of the sanctioned people, and they have these license guidelines, and there are different laws and regulations for the Korean version of the SDN. And when you look at the types of the SDN or the sanctions, there are like a financial trade and travel ban, and also the aviation and the maritime. There are different types of restrictions. And there are the government ministries, different ministries are in charge of these sanctions. For example, for the trade sanctions, we have the Ministry of the Trade, Industry and Energy and the Korean Security Agency of Trade and Industry for the dual-use items. And we also have the Defense Acquisition Program Administration, and also the Bank of Korea and the Ministry of the Economy and Finance and the Financial Services Commission for finance. And for travel ban and the aviation or maritime, we have the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport and Justice. So in a word, we have different parties working on different sanctions, and they are under the Korean laws and regulations. So to understand them, you have to also understand the UN and US sanctions to better understand the intention and the spirit of the regulations. But still, in Korea, to have the trade with North Korea, what do you need to do? You need to have the authorization. And in particular, for the dual-use items or suspicious dual-use items, you have to follow the notice on the import and export of strategic materials, and you need to get the permission from the Korean government, and that's for the situational permission. And you have to go through the process to get the permission, and also that there is a general license under the US sanctions, and we also have the general exemption. So without having the exemptions, you may be qualified for the exemption. And in the US, they have a special licensing. So in the Korea, we have some similar program, and for that technology should not really interrupt the peace or the security of the international community. So it's like in the US, you get the special licensing and you provide the humanitarian aid. So that's the similar context. So in terms of the procedures, it's very similar to what they have in the US and UN sanctions. For those special license in Korea, there is a process for the application. It takes like 15 days. But there's other procedures that are not taken into this 15 days. So usually it takes like 2 to 3 months. So it's a bit long, but like compared to OFAC or the U.S. Treasury Department's process for licensing, it's quite shorter than what they have in the U.S. So in the U.S., for the licensing, it takes a lot of time, and practically it's not easy. But in Korea, it's not that long. It's not the prohibitively long, I think. So what about the recent enforcement actions in terms of the sanctions against North Korea? What about the trend in Korea? Well, under the current administration, which is coming to an end of the term, but under the compared to the previous administration, we witnessed a strong differences. That's a part of the engagement policies. Since 2017, we saw a huge reduction in the sanctions, and for the financial sanctions, the SDN list, the Korean list, was released, and after that there was no additional list announced or released. And what has been done, for the trade sanctions, for example, the P Pioneer, the vessel, and the Light Windmore vessel in 2017 and 2018, these vessels were detained, and the UN and the US sanctions were applied, and we made the enforcement in Korea. So we detained them for the ship-to-ship transport, the illegal transport of the oil products, and they detained the vessels, and they were released recently. So in 2017 and 18 and 19, a few times we had this enforcement of the maritime and the trade sanctions. And as was mentioned before, for the financial sanctions in 2017, the SDN list has not been updated or added, but until the 2017, we had the list. As you can see here, the grounds are based on the U.S. sanctions, and sometimes it's UN or Japan or Australia, but mostly it's based on the U.S. sanctions. And some are based on our own sanctions, but when you look it deeper, it's like a 50% rule. So it's a part of the U.S. sanctions when it's related to the U.S. person. So technically speaking, these are also based on the U.S. sanctions when Korea enforces this sanction list. So my conclusion is, as I mentioned earlier, the sanctions in Korea against North Korea for past 5 years at least were mostly from the U.S. and the UN sanctions. The UN sanctions take a bigger part, and these were the basis for the Korean sanction. That's what I want to highlight. So that is why today we invited David DJ Wolf on the U.S. And the UN sanctions, and that's really helpful, and that's going to be something that people who are engaging with North Korea in terms of the trade, they need to fully understand the requirements of the U.S. and also the NGOs, for example, as like DJ Wolf is working with the NGO and the humanitarian aid. He's working hard for the licensing for the humanitarian aid. And as was mentioned before, it's a general license, though it may not need the special license, but still banks in Korea or the Ministry of Unification in Korea for the humanitarian aid, they may look at the special license or the UN exemption. They practically asking for these licenses, and this humanitarian aid for the couple of years ago, for the past couple of years, that have been also based on the licensing approval or special exemptions of the UN and US sanctions. So I think that's about what's going on in Korea, enforcement and application of the sanctions. So I provided an overview. So I think that's also relevant to the presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Kim. And so I think you skipped some part from your presentation. So it's about the NGOs and about the items that have been already exempted. They need to seek the license for the items that have been already exempted for every time they want to do the dealing. So this is kind of the white list, and they need to also get like overlapping or redundant approval from the Korean government. So maybe we can think about that like a comprehensive re-exemption that we can seek from the UN, US, and the Korea, because otherwise it's too cumbersome, and the white list can be something that later David can mention on that as well. So we have lawyer Kwon Soon-yeom from Lee & Co. Are you there? So 10 minutes for you. Well, it may not take full 10 minutes, but thank you, David Wolf, for your overview on the U.S. and the UN sanctions, and thank you, Mr. Kim, on the Korean law. What I'm going to share with you today is beyond the legal perspective. Given the current conditions of North Korea, we need to increase the humanitarian aid. But in doing that, what are the obstacles? So that's what I want to talk about from a macro level. So, can you move on to the next slide. And next slide. So my point here is that under the Trump administration, they had the maximum pressure campaign. So it's quite stronger in the sanctions against North Korea. And these were having impact on North Korea. So let me elaborate on that. And under the Biden administration, so how their policies are shifting. So that's what I want to highlight. And I also want to talk about, given all these macro changes, what do we need to do to provide the humanitarian aid and what are the issues? So on the first slide, you can see the UN sanctions against North Korea started since 2006. And for North Korea, they are putting a lot of pressure, especially with the nuclear test in 2016. And the UN released the sanctions. And in 2016, the luxury exports or the North Korean workers working in the overseas, they couldn't really increase the number. So these were the bans. But in 2017, with the Trump administration, they had the maximum pressure campaign for the sectoral restrictions. So for their like a cash flow in businesses like the iron ore or coal export and the seafood and the textiles, those 4 key areas of the exports have been pointed out as a sanction of the UN in 2017. So they were banned from being exported. So it was really devastating for North Korea to stop their whole trade. So that was the start of the maximum pressure campaign under the Trump administration. And also they couldn't import the oil and they couldn't really drive the car and they had a rationing of the oil. So it really had a huge impact on North Korea. Next slide. So with this sweeping range of the import and export bans, in 2018, they started to take effect. So in 2017, right after that, North Korean trade volume was cut by half. And also in 2018 and 19, it went down further. And compared to 16, it was about 60% down. So that actually had the economic impacts. So with this maximum pressure campaign, the U.S. administrations kept putting the pressure. For example, the OFAC, the general license were for some NGOs in North Korea, and the medicine and the food-related general license are there. So all these applications have been virtually delayed. That's what they did. So the humanitarian aid was also almost suspended or delayed. And the Trump administration almost banned the travel to North Korea so that people, the humanitarian workers, cannot enter North Korea. So this maximum pressure campaign actually had an impact even on the humanitarian aid, and the aid went down by almost went down to like 10% of the previous level. So it worked. And one example is that the UN sanctions. So the China, for example, took it as a loophole, and the President Xi Jinping led the program to North Korea. In 2019, the tourism visa, like 220,000 people went to or traveled to North Korea, and even without the visa, with the daily passage authorization, about 90,000 people went to North Korea. So in total, it was about 290,000 people or Chinese people. So that really helped North Korea to earn hard currencies. So that was one exception. So next slide. So with that, indeed, North Korean economy started to be hit hard, and the first impact was the food shortage, and that is a chronic problem in North Korea. So the North Korea wanted to earn hard currency mostly from China and Russia, and they need to import crops, but the hard currencies could not be earned due to the maximum pressure campaign. So they struggled to get the crops. So the only option for them was the humanitarian aid, but under the maximum pressure campaign, the aid was also stopped. So even this year, the price of the crops increased like 2 times and 4 times for the rice, flour, and the sugar. And so they had a food shortage in the market. And also, Kim Jong-un also mentioned that or admitted that they are having severe food shortage. And we were also surprised by the fact that the North Korean army, their stock of the rice was also released to the people, and even the reserves that they have for the military, that was also made. It was like in June after they had this people's general meeting. So it shows how serious the situation is, because they are now diverting the rice they reserved for the military to the people. So it means they are having really, really severe food shortage. Next page, next slide. But under the Biden administration, in April this year, they reviewed their whole policy on North Korea, and the result or the finding, of course, the key here is how to denuclearize North Korea and what kind of different path they will take from the Trump administration. That was the part of the review. But the result, many people wondered what their conclusion is, but not much details have been disclosed. The only thing was that the Biden administration, unlike their previous, because the Trump took this all or nothing approach. That was the approach for Trump, but they want to have like a more phased and flexible approach. So that was the only thing that was disclosed to the outside of the White House. But this phased approach, what is it exactly? That's not really known to the outer world. And the other thing is that unlike the previous administration, the Biden administration also places an emphasis on the importance of close coordination with allies. So it means that when it comes to these sanctions against North Korea, they will be open and they will listen to what South Korea thinks. But when it comes to the sanctions against North Korea, it's a positive and encouraging sign. So the Biden administration is now taking more practical approach than their previous administration. But in reality, they have not released any or eased any sanctions against North Korea. So they will listen more to allies and they will take a phased approach. But how that will be translated into the actual implementation, we are not seeing any changes. But what instead, for the humanitarian aid, they may take it as an exemption make it exception. So in October 2021, they had a review on their policy on North Korea, and there are some implications, and they are now trying to minimize the sanctions damages to unintended targets. But what we need to note here is there are the population, the general public, getting damaged or suffering from the sanctions. So for these unintended consequences, the Treasury Department mentioned that that is an important action that the Biden administration need to take. Next slide. And also in May, President Moon had a summit with President Biden, and Biden said that he is fully supporting the inter-Korean dialogue, and the two leaders thought about how to activate and promote the humanitarian aid. And also on the UN side, as was mentioned by the other people, they want to have the exemption procedures and simplifying or streamlining that so that they can apply for these exemptions, the NGOs for the humanitarian aid, and the UN will follow up on this so that the humanitarian aid can become more active under the Biden administration. And other than that, the diplomatic party, the Ed Markey, is trying to enhance North Korean Humanitarian Assistance Act that was proposed by Edward Markey May this year. And the OFAC has the general license to support the NGOs, but that's quite narrow in terms of the scope. So this proposed bill is to expand that, and it's also about how many general license applications are authorized, whether it's for the food or medicine. So when we do the monitoring, this can put also on pressure. So I checked on this, but in reality, the chance of this law being passed is low because, as Mr. Wolf mentioned, in the US, the sanctions are working. People think that way. So why do we need to go soft? Why do we need change? So that is for the public opinion. So this law is not likely to be passed. But still, for the humanitarian aid, the needs are recognized in the United States. Next slide. So for the humanitarian aid, what are the issues now? So as I mentioned, under the Biden administration, they want to, and they saw the need to increase the humanitarian aid, and the unintended consequences are not what they want, and they came up with a proposed bill, and that they want to increase the general licenses. But the thing is that the North Korea has this border control, and due to the COVID-19, they closed the borders, and that is really the unprecedented condition that we are witnessing. So even though we want to provide humanitarian aid, food, and rice, but they are closing the doors. So it's really severe situation because they are rejecting this COVID vaccine, like over 6 million vaccine or doses. They are refusing to receive that. And also the rice, in 2019, it was like 400,000 tons of rice to be sent to North Korea, but it's not really working. So the macro level, the policies are changing in the positive direction, but in reality, the border lockdown is hampering this whole progress. And also in terms of the political perspective, North Korea is saying that it's not the humanitarian aid that we want. We want to relax or ease the sanctions so that we can export the iron ore and coal so that we can have economic growth. So it's not the humanitarian aid that we want. That's what North Korea is saying. So that's the differences in terms of the stances by the stakeholders. So the humanitarian aid is seeing some limitations. So next slide. So to summarize, the humanitarian aid for the next few years, it's hard to become more active. That is true at a macro level because North Korea need to open its borders, but in November with China, they were trying to reopen the border, but due to the Omicron variant, they decided not to open the border. So how long it will last, we are not sure. So that is one uncertainty. And North Korea is also may use the humanitarian aid, and that's not what they want. They want to see the sanctions going away. So the humanitarian aid, how much they will welcome the humanitarian aid, there's limitations as well. And for the U.S. side as well, the sanctions are working, and North Korea is not doing another nuclear test and not the long-range missiles fired. So they think it's the right path to take to keep the status quo. I think the U.S. thinks it's the best way. So the current status, they don't want to do anything about the current status. So they think it's working under the current sanctions, so they don't want to change anything. So the only thing or the only issue is the humanitarian aid. But for the humanitarian aid, they are working on their own, one way or another. And it's North Korea to be blamed for closing their border. So from the micro level, if we want to provide a large-scale aid, the monitoring people should be in North Korea, but North Korea is not likely to welcome them. And even the diplomatic missions in North Korea could not leave out of North Korea, and they cannot get into North Korea. So it's less likely for North Korea to accept these humanitarian workers. So the large-scale humanitarian projects will not be implemented. Next slide. So to summarize, the Korean government or the Biden administration, they understand the food shortage in North Korea and the humanitarian crisis, and they know that the general public is now suffering. That's not what they intended. So they want to increase the humanitarian aid. There is the consensus that that's what's needed, but still North Korea wants to ease the sanctions, but that's not what the two other parties want. So the sanctions will be still there, and with the lockdown of the borders, we cannot provide the humanitarian aid as much as we want. Then the North Korean will suffer more in terms of the economy and food shortage. So that's it from me. Thank you very much, Mr. Kwon, and I'm sorry for not giving you more time, and we are behind the schedule, but Mr. Wolf, you can comment on this whole discussion for like 3 minutes.
Thank you. I'll be even briefer than that. I thank you very much, Mr. Kim, Mr. Kwon. I agree entirely with both presentations, and in fact, the comments, particularly from Mr. Kwon on some of the Biden administration's perspectives and the fact that it's looking to be more multilateral, I think may open up a door for the suggestion that Chairman Kang, you had, which I think is an interesting one, the idea of a white list. There is the legal structure would enable that. The way the UN sanctions are set up, given that they itemize products by customs code, They could certainly exempt them by code. You would need a UN Security Council resolution to do that. But if you had pressure from US allies to push for that, it seems that this administration may be more amenable than its predecessors to a coordinated multilateral approach there, taking in mind the domestic politic challenges they have on the US side, which is they're not going to dramatically ramp down a program, but there is certainly appetite for how do you facilitate humanitarian work. So with that, thank you to both of the discussants and thank you to the chairman for the opportunity.
Thank you very much. Yes, right. As Wolf mentioned, you have been staying here for like 3 hours for session 1, 2, and 3. And thank you very much for staying with us for the long hours at this late hour for your time. I hope the COVID-19 goes over and we can meet in person. So I think time is up for now, and we need to conclude this international seminar. Once again, I'd like to thank all the participants joining us online and offline. And as you know, due to the COVID-19 and pandemic, the whole world needs to seek solidarity and cooperation to overcome this pandemic. And also, for now, we are having this global pandemic, and we are learning how we are closely connected around the world. So I think the cooperation also includes North Korea. We could see that. As you may know, and as was mentioned before, to prevent the spread of the COVID-19, the North Korea is closing their doors, and they are getting more and more isolated, and they are not struggling. And the whole pathway getting to North Korea is stopped, and the humanitarian aids and supplies cannot get into North Korea, and the people are suffering so much. Of course, even before the COVID-19, things were hard and tough, and with these sanctions, we could not send the supplies, and the whole financial transactions are stopped. And that's still what we see today. And these sanctions against North Korea was to stop the nuclear programs of North Korea, but it's causing unintended consequences against its people. And that's what we learned from, or confirmed from today's seminar. So we hope that these should not negatively affect North Korean people in any way. And also, the sanctions against North Korea is not a goal, and that should work as effective means to bring peace on the Korean Peninsula. And also, it should not be an obstacle in bringing peace on the Korean Peninsula and inter-Korean cooperation. So in this regard, these sanctions against North Korea need to be reconsidered and revisited. That was mentioned in the seminar. So to build a consensus and to have support from the international community, the Korean government and the civic society in Korea need to work together. So I hope that we can improve the humanitarian conditions in North Korea, and our inter-Korean cooperation will continue, although it stopped in 2019. This whole the Korean process and also the peace process. And I hope that the seminar could contribute to reopening this whole dialogue and the peace process on the Korean Peninsula. So I hope that we have like 15 or 20 days to go for 2021. I hope you will have a great closing for 2021. And that concludes the international seminar. Once again, thank you again for staying with us, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.